somebody must have taken advantage. I kept my voice level. I'd been practicing level. I told my mother that Gran had just tested perfectly sharp at the doctor, that there was a signed report saying so. The silence on the line went cold and thoughtful. I'd meant it as reassurance. I realize now I'd shown her a card too early. Well, my mother said finally, recalculating. Old people can be sharp one day and gone the next. Doctors don't see what we see. Then, softer, almost kind, which was worse. You're too close to her, honey. It's clouding your judgment. She hung up, and I sat with the brass key in my hand, turning it over, and understood that this was no longer just about a house. They had started, very quietly, to question whether my grandmother was a whole person with the right to decide, and I knew, the way you know a storm by the smell, that they wouldn't stop there. The coming soon sign came down, and a for sale sign went up in its place, and the difference between those two signs is the difference between a threat and an act. It went live on the listing sites the same morning. Photos of my grandmother's kitchen, her bedroom, the porch Earl built, all staged and bright and captioned with words like charming and great bones, and motivated seller. Motivated. I drove past on my lunch break, and there it was, planted in Earl's grass, Cindy's smiling face turned toward the road. Two neighbors stood at the property line, and I knew without hearing that they were asking each other the question the whole street was asking. Is Opal all right? Did something happen to Opal? My grandmother had lived on that road for 60 years, and now her home was a sale and she was the subject of sidewalk worry. That's its own kind of cruelty. The public kind. The kind that makes people whisper your loved one into something pitiable. I called my mother, not to argue, just to confirm what I was seeing. She answered distracted, half in a meeting somewhere. It's just logistics, Serena, she said, the phrase again, worn smooth from use. The memory care place takes her Medicaid. This is the responsible thing. Logistics. I looked at the porch light, which was on even in the daylight, even now, burning steady over a for sale sign, like it refused to acknowledge the thing planted beneath it. And something in me that had been waiting, polite and patient like my grandmother, quietly set its feet. I wasn't going to label cabinets and drive boxes. I was going to find out what was in that sewing room, and I was going to be ready when she told me it was time. I work for elder law attorneys, so the next morning I did at my desk what I'd been afraid to do at home. I read everything we had on life estates. I told myself it was for a client. It wasn't. Here is what a reservation of a life estate means. In plain words, the way I'd explain it to one of our families across the table. When you deed your home but reserve a life estate, you give the ownership away now, but you keep the absolute right to live there for the rest of your life. The person you deed it to is called the remainder man. They own what comes after. And the part that mattered most for Wexler Road, the part I read 3 times to be sure. Under Ohio law, a life tenant generally cannot be forced out, and the property usually cannot be sold during her lifetime unless both the life tenant and the remainder man agree and sign. Both of them. If Opal had reserved a life estate 6 years ago and deeded the remainder to someone, then my parents' power of attorney was a key to a door that no longer existed. They couldn't sell that house out from under her. Not legally, not without the signature of whoever's name was cut off at the margin of that scan. I sat back in my chair, and the whole shape of it finally turned toward me. My grandmother hadn't been waiting helplessly for rescue. She had quietly, years ago, with her wits about her, and nobody rushing, built a wall around her home that my parents had walked straight into without seeing. And everything I needed to prove it was sitting behind a small brass lock my grandmother had already handed me, in a cabinet she'd told me not to open until she said so. I touched the key in my pocket. Soon, I thought. She'll tell me soon. If you've ever been the one in the family who reads the fine print while everybody else is busy spending what isn't theirs yet, you already know how lonely that quiet can get. You see the cliff coming, and nobody wants the map. Stay with me, because what my grandmother had been holding behind that lock changed every conversation that came after it. Subscribe, so the next one finds you. The call came on a Tuesday, the way she'd promised weeks before. Come for tea, Opal said. 4 o'clock. And Serena, bring your key. She'd never said bring your key before. My pulse picked up. But it wasn't only me she'd invited. I discovered when I pulled into the drive and saw my parents' car already there, and Derek's truck behind it. My mother had told Opal she was coming by with some paperwork for her to sign, a listing disclosure, an expanded power of attorney, the documents that would smooth the sale and tie up the last loose ends. Opal had said sweetly that they should all come at 4 and have some tea and bring the papers. So they'd taken it as a victory. They thought she was finally cooperating. They walked in expecting an old woman ready to sign her name where she was told. The porch light was on. The kettle was already singing. My grandmother sat at the head of her own table with 2 pots of tea steeping and her good cups out. The whole service, like she was hosting something. She'd set a place for everyone, even me, even the people who'd come to take her home. I stood in the doorway with a brass key in my pocket and watched her pour the first cup, slow and even, the spoon ringing once against the china, calling the meeting to order. My father had the papers in a manila envelope, and he set them by Opal's saucer like a man laying down a winning hand he was slightly ashamed of. "Mom, we just need a few signatures," he said. "It makes everything easier. The listing and a little update to the power of attorney, so we can handle the closing without dragging you to an office." My mother slid a pen across the table. "Right here, Opal. And here. We've marked them." They were gentle about it, which was the obscene part. Gentle the way you are with someone you've decided doesn't fully count. Derek wouldn't look at anyone. He stared into his teacup like it might have an exit in it. I started to stand. Started to say, "Wait," because I couldn't watch them walk her into signing away the last of her standing. But Opal lifted one finger off the table, just slightly, and tipped her chin at me. The smallest motion. It said, clear as speech. "Sit down, honey, and let me." So I sat. I trusted her. She picked up the pen my mother had given her. She turned it over in her fingers, examining it like an unfamiliar object. And the whole table leaned in, certain she was about to sign. Then she set the pen down beside the cup, very precisely, and folded her hands. "Before I sign anything," she said, in the mild voice she used for the tomatoes and the weather, "Serena, would you go to my sewing room and bring me the blue folder? It's in the cabinet under the window." The table went still. My mother's smile faltered at the edges, and I felt the brass key in my pocket go from a small warm weight to the heaviest thing I had ever carried. I walked down the hall to the sewing room with everyone's eyes on my back. My hands weren't quite steady when I knelt at the cabinet under the window and fit the brass key into the lock. It turned easy, oiled, like it had been waiting. Inside, on top of folded quilt batting, sat a single blue folder, its cover soft and furred at the corners from years of handling, a thick rubber band stretched around it to hold it closed. It had weight to it. I carried it back to the table with both hands and set it in front of my grandmother. She slid the rubber band off, opened it, and lifted out the first document. She didn't read it aloud. She didn't make a speech. She simply held it across the table to my father. "You'll want to read this one first, Roy," she said. My father took it the way you take something you already suspect will bite. I watched his eyes go to the top of the page, to the heading, and I watched the color leave his face from the forehead down. It was a deed. Recorded. Stamped by the county recorder with a date 6 years gone, the spring after Earl's funeral. I could see enough of it from where I stood to read the words that mattered, the words I'd been chasing through a cutoff scan for weeks. Reservation of a life estate. Grantor. Opal Holt. And in the grantee line, in the remainder, the name that had been hidden at the margin, Serena Holt. Me. My father read it once. Then he read it again, his lips moving slightly. And then my father, who had come to his mother's house to get her to sign away her home, pulled out a chair and sat down. Nobody had asked him to. His knees just stopped holding him. He looked up at me across the table with an expression I'd never seen on him, like I'd done something to him. I hadn't done anything. She had. 6 years ago. While they weren't watching. For a moment nobody spoke. Then my mother snatched the deed out of my father's hands and read it herself, fast, her eyes jumping down the page. "This isn't real," she said, but her voice had a crack in it that said she already knew it was. Opal sipped her tea. "It's recorded down at the courthouse, Lynn. Has been for 6 years. Anyone can pull it. Serena could have told you that weeks ago if you'd let her finish a sentence." Then she set her cup down and explained it to the table the way you'd explain it to children, kindly and without mercy. Earl had been gone a season. She'd known, even then, how money makes people forget themselves. So she'd gone to a lawyer, Howard Pruitt, 2 towns over, and she deeded the house, but kept a life estate. The house was hers to live in until her last day. That part the law protected. The ownership after her was already given to me. I made Serena the remainder, she said, because she's the only one who ever came out here just to sit. Not to measure the rooms. She looked at my father. You can't sell what isn't yours, Roy. You never could. There was never a day in the last 6 years that you could. The pen still sat by her saucer, untouched. And then she said the thing that I think about more than any other, mild as milk,